Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. We are joined here by the great Tony Gale. Thanks for joining us again, Tony.
It's my pleasure.
Excellent.
Always happy to be here.
Always happy to have you. Tony's actually vying for my job, I think, currently. We're to get him a nice little spot, right next to me, so he can actually just be the new host of these. So today, Tony is going to be talking about getting started with dynamic movement, specifically related to time-lapse photography. I want to give a huge thank you to Tony for doing this. This is part of a three-part series. So this is the third portion, the last portion of a three-part series. So if you haven't already, please make sure to go back to livestream.com/bheventspace and check out all the other two events that he spoke about. Also want to give a special thank you to the sponsors of this event, the Vitek Imaging Group. Thank you very much for getting Tony together with us and having him here. Tony, I know you have a ton to cover as always, but just want to say thank you again for being here and enjoy the show, everybody. Make sure to get any questions in the Zoom and live stream and Facebook as well.
All right. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. As discussed, I am Tony Gale. I am a New York City-based photographer, and today I'm going to be going over getting started with dynamic movement time-lapse, even in your backyard. As Scott mentioned, this is a third of a three-part series. The middle one was video, so there's some overlap between this and last time, but time-lapse is definitely its own beast. I want to thank the B&H Event Space and, of course, Manfrotto, Joby, Lastolite, Lowepro, and Syrup, all part of Vitek Imaging Group, for having me. Without all of them, I wouldn't be here. And I'm also a Sony Artisan of Imagery, an X-Rite Colorati, and the APA National President. So if any of that comes up, nobody can say I didn't tell you. As I said, I'm a commercial photographer based in New York, mostly people and portraits, editorial corporate advertising, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, some video, some stills, a little bit of everything. All right, so what we're going to be going over is getting started with dynamic movement time-lapse. What is time-lapse? Planning your time-lapse, creating the time-lapse videos, adding movement, and assembling and editing the time-lapse. So what is a time-lapse? A time-lapse is essentially a video that is faster. It is a video where you are showing the passage of time. It's one of those things that different people say different things, but in general, what differentiates time-lapse from regular video is it's not shot in real time, it's shot over a period of time. So that one of Honolulu there was done over about 2 hours. Any video is a whole bunch of still frames put together. Time-lapse is also a whole bunch of still frames put together. It's just that the gap between the frames is more. When you're shooting video, you might be shooting at 24 frames a second. And when doing that, you're capturing 24 frames every second and then playing it back at 24 frames every second. With time-lapse, it might be a picture every second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, hour, day, whatever. It's a much longer period of time. So it shows the passage of time. Everything goes faster. This is the Empire State Building here. This was also over several hours. That is what you need. And then as we're going through it, one of the important things with time-lapse is there needs to be movement. So we're going to be going over dynamic movement, which to me is, moving the camera, that kind of thing. But any time-lapse needs movement. Something has to move. Either the camera has to move, or something in your frame has to move, or both. If only your camera moves and nothing else moves, it's just going to look like it's a regular video. If you do a time-lapse of your living room and the light doesn't change and nobody walks through and nothing changes, it could be a 5-minute video clip you created in 5 minutes or over 10 hours, and you won't be able to tell the difference. So think about what will change in your frame. And it's also something that you can do that doesn't have to be specific things. You can do like that little self-portrait I did there over a couple of seconds, where you do a portrait, or so you have a subject that isn't moving and the background's moving. They do it in movies a lot. It can be something like this that I did for a client where I was photographing and I had a camera set up in the corner, taking a picture every 5 seconds. And I put that together as a little behind the scenes. It's a good way if you are shooting for clients to just add something. Like a lot of clients will ask me to shoot video. If the budget isn't high enough, it's not always possible. I can't bring in another team to shoot video. And if there isn't time for me to stop and switch, setting up a time-lapse camera is a great way to go. Or, you know, maybe you're cooking Thanksgiving dinner and you think it would be cool to show how Thanksgiving dinner develops or how the table gets set, everybody eats and leaves, or any number of things. Just setting a camera up in the corner and letting it run on a time-lapse can be a cool way to do it too. All right, so what gear do you need? To start with, the only thing you absolutely need is a camera or a phone. This video that's a blurry, jumbly mess, that time lapse I did with a camera around my neck, where every second or two I would just hit the shutter myself. You can see when you do that, there's no consistency. It just jumps around like crazy, but you can do it. You can do it timing it yourself and holding the camera. Or this one, I did it with the time-lapse app in my Sony Alpha 1, but I just held the camera and walked around. So you can do it, but it's jumpy, it's bumpy. If that's the look you're going for, that's great. But most of the time, something a little bit more stable is probably the answer. So the gear I would recommend, first, you need a bag. You need something to carry your stuff. I prefer backpacks to shoulder bags, like the Flipside 300 here, or the 400 if you need something bigger. I also prefer backpacks with waist belts, which these both have, and they can carry a lot of stuff. A tripod. If you're only going to get one piece of gear for a time lapse, I think a tripod is the single most important thing, assuming your camera has a built-in intervalometer. Otherwise, you have to buy the intervalometer. Or if you're going to use a phone, a smartphone mount for your tripod, and even just being on a tripod, not moving anything, like this of Times Square from a few years ago from the before times, just having the camera steady so things don't bounce around is going to make your time lapses more interesting, or at least more professional looking. I mean, it might be interesting if everything's all jumbly and wonky, but you don't know what you're going to get, and most of the time it's just a mess. So camera or phone, definitely. Intervalometer. If you have a phone, you can download an app, or your phone might have an app built in. I use an app called Lapse It on my Android, my Sony Xperia 5 Mark II. If you have a camera, a lot of the cameras now have a built-in intervalometer app. I'm not going to get into how that works, but it's built into the camera. If not, B&H has a whole ton of third-party intervalometers that you can buy that plug into your camera, and you can set how many frames, how far apart you want it to shoot, all of that. And then with something like this, the stars, there's no way you're going to do this without a tripod. There's just no way. Stars moving with that little bounce back. You could theoretically put your camera somewhere with some rocks underneath it or a bag of sand and point it in the right direction, but it's going to be really, really difficult to get the right position. And if something shifts, it's over. Tripod, very important. All right, so you've got your tripod. There are other things that I recommend and really like, and we will get to those. That's just the bare bones to start with. You've got your tripod. You want to start planning your time lapse. Think about how long do you want the final video to be? Do you want it to be 10 seconds? If you're going to play it back at 24 frames a second, 10 seconds is 240 frames. If you're going to do 30 frames per second, it's 300 frames. And what time period do you want to capture? Do you want 20 minutes? So your frame 1 is at 0 and frame 240 is at 20 minutes. If that's what your plan is, a 10-second video at 24 frames a second, 20 minutes is 1,200 seconds. So that would be a 5-second interval. So 240 frames at 20 minutes is a frame every 5 seconds for 20 minutes. Is that the right answer? Maybe, maybe not. We'll talk a little bit about picking the right interval. I would also say, much like in video, with time lapse, you want the time lapse to start earlier than you think and go longer than you think. There have been a lot of time lapses I've done where I thought, oh yeah, 40 minutes will be great. And if I'd gone an hour, it would have been better. Not necessarily that you want to use that all of it, but the back end got better or the front end was better. And it's hard to predict that, especially with weather and light changing. So always run your time lapse longer than you think. If you think 10 minutes is right, do 15. And then think about the interval. So this is 1 frame every half second, I believe, on a gimbal. We'll talk about gimbals and how useful they can be. So, that's pretty quick. This is a frame every 10 seconds, I believe. So the first one moved very quickly. You saw everything. The second one, the one I just played, moves so quick that you sort of lose any cohesiveness. You lose a sense of the direction and what you're doing. The interval was too long on that. And then this was every 5 seconds of the sun setting from my apartment in Brooklyn. So what you are capturing a time lapse of matters, and the period of time you want. Something like the sky and the sun setting and this clouds moving, maybe 5 seconds is the right answer. Something like what I had there, where you mount a camera to a car and drive around, every 5 seconds is probably going to be a jumbled mess. It has to do with how fast whatever is in your frame is moving. And so think about that. I've done tests in Prospect Park, for example, of people running and biking. And if it's not really every second or two, if it's less than that, it just feels jerky because things are moving too fast. So think about that. The beauty of what we're doing now and the time we're in is with digital, you can try something, run it for 2 minutes, just play it, hit play and cycle through as fast as you can on the back of the camera. Does that look right? Does it not look right? If you're ever not sure, do a shorter interval because you can always cut frames. If you do a frame every second and then later think, oh, it should have been a frame every 4 seconds, you can just remove 2/3 of those frames and it's effectively the same thing. All right. So we've got all that. Now you want to create that first time lapse. For time lapse, much like video, you want to be manual shutter, manual f-stop, select an ISO, use a specific white balance, and usually manual focus, or always manual focus. With video, usually manual focus, sometimes autofocus. If I'm doing a person, an interview, I'll use autofocus with video. With time lapse, you want to lock everything down most of the time because you'll see it jump around. It gets all jittery and flickery and the white balance can change. If you see a white balance shift, that's bad. So usually you want to lock everything down. We'll talk about some exceptions to that. So do that. Experiment, get the exposure you want. I would recommend capturing in RAW. You can do JPEG, but one of the big advantages of RAW is if you decide that the white balance should have been something different, you can correct it. You've got all that resolution. You've got all that exposure latitude. You've got a lot more flexibility than if you capture in JPEG. So this is 100th of a second, f5.6, ISO 100, cloudy white balance, manual focus on a Manfrotto 460 gimbal. There's going to be a few here where we're going to think about the shutter speed. So when you're capturing video, those of you who watch that know if you're capturing at 24 frames a second, generally you want to be shooting at a 50th of a second, really 48th, but your camera probably doesn't do that. If you're capturing at 30 frames a second, a 60th. With time lapse, the rule's not quite the same. You do typically want a little bit of blur. But if you were capturing a frame every 5 seconds, so you decided that your shutter speed should be 2.5 seconds, you're likely getting too much blur. So it's a fine line. This is 100th of a second. You can see there's not really any blur. When you see people walking, it feels a little jittery because that 100th of a second might be a little fast for what I was doing. Just walking around sort of Midtown with the gimbal. Here's an example of what happens when it's on auto. So program auto, ISO 400, auto white balance, auto focus. This worked better than I thought, but you can see the exposure changes periodically, and that can be a little jarring. When I did this, it was to show you what not to do, and it looked better than I expected it to, but you still want to be careful. So that first one was 100th of a second. To go to another extreme, this is a 1/4 second. And with this, it feels a lot more fluid. So still on the gimbal, walking around, but you can see because the cars are blurred and the people blur a little, it feels like motion. It feels more natural because when you're going through like that, things are going fast. Things need to feel fast, and they don't feel fast if everything's sharp. But like anything, the right shutter speed, it's going to depend on what you're doing. One of the things to think about, if you remember the old, like Harryhausen, the old time-lapse stuff, like Clash of the Titans from 1980, all that time-lapse stuff, part of the reason, or not time-lapse, stop-motion stuff, part of the reason the stop-motion stuff feels fake is because everything is sharp. You know, they take the model, they set it, they take a picture, they move it a little, take a picture, move it again, take a picture, move it again, take a picture. And because of that, we lose that motion, that blur that we get normally when capturing film or video, motion or video. And so it feels wrong. I just learned the other day, listening to a podcast, that with stop motion now, there's a technique where they'll actually cause things to be a little bit blurry sometimes, so it feels more natural, so you get that blur. And then this is 0.3. All right, and then, so those were on gimbals. We'll talk about hyperlapse and gimbals more in a little bit. There's also just locking it down. So this is still on the gimbal, but the gimbal is just setting on the ground. 0.3 seconds. So you can see like that cyclist in the front who wasn't really moving. He remains relatively sharp. Everything else is blurry, and it feels like there's activity. It feels like things are sped up instead of just being jerky. Same thing at a 30th of a second. Still blurry, but it's not quite, you don't quite have the streaks. You don't quite have as much motion. And then 1/25th of a second, same thing. And you can see the 1/25th of a second, because again, everything is sharp, it feels a little more jittery. So think about that shutter speed. All right. So that's if you're down. That was with the gimbal. The gimbal has a nice little tripod. You can just set it down. However, I wouldn't recommend capturing static time lapses like that with a gimbal, even though the 460 has that nice little tripod. A more robust tripod like the Manfrotto Element is a better choice for that. It's much more stable. Like on those, you may have seen there was a little bit of sway and movement. All right, so we're going to add some dynamic movement. What does that mean? We did some just locked down. Here's the camera pointed in a direction. Looks cool, great. But just like capturing normal video, you can pan and tilt, and you can move forward and back, left and right. So we can try those. So here, Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, right down the street, Manfrotto Element M2 Traveler Tripod. It's fine, looks fine. But if we add something like the Syrup Genie Mini 2, which is a device that mounts to your tripod, then your camera mounts to that, that allows you to set a rotation. You can also use it for video. So this is with the Genie Mini 2 with a 1 second ramp up. You may have noticed that the beginning of the video was a little slower. It speeds up in the middle, and at the very end, it slows down again. That's a 1 second ramp up at the beginning and the end, which is a feature that the app lets you do. Having that motion, having that panning can make things a little more interesting. It breaks things up. It doesn't feel static. That's just simple panning movement with the Genie Mini 2. You use the app, the Syrup app. It's on iOS. It's on Android. The app is free. You can set how much of a rotation you want to do. All you do is you just move the little start and end icon. Green is start, blue is end. Move it around, tell it what you want to do. You can set the record time. So right now, 3 minutes, 30 seconds. You can set hours, minutes, seconds. You can set the play time. So it's a little bit like the exposure triangle. The record time, the play time, and the interval all work together. And if you change one, it affects everything. So the play time, I want it to record for this amount of time and play for this amount of time. If you do that, it will automatically set the interval. But you can set the interval yourself. And then you can set the interval separately if you want, and then it will affect the others. One real nice thing about using the app and using the Syrup devices is that it will let you do fractions of a second. So most intervalometers, in my experience, can do 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, minutes, whatever. But they can't do 1.5 seconds. The Syrup app will let you do tenths of a second. So you could do 1.4 seconds if that was the right thing, or 1.1 or 2.7, whatever it is. It gives you more control if whatever you're doing matters. You could be creating something where 1 second is not enough and 2 seconds is too much. With most intervalometers, too bad, you're stuck. You'll have to do 1 second and then cut frames or something. With the Syrup app, you could do 1.5 seconds. It's a very cool feature. And then you can also add, if you want it, an ease out. So that was only a 5-second clip, so I only had a 1 second ease out. But that ramp up is the ease out. So you can tell it how quickly to ramp up, to start slow and go fast, and then end slow. Sometimes that's makes things feel a little more natural, speeding up, slowing down. And you can set that here. So if it was a 20-second clip that I was doing, I could have done a 3-second ease out. And then again, other reasons that you might consider panning. This is also with the Genie Mini 2. It allows you to capture more space. So not just a road, but here's a rooftop. You're seeing more Brooklyn. And I personally like the reveal of having a foreground element that the camera moves past. So we start with that Japanese maple, and it slowly moves past it. You see more and more of the city. You see more and more Brooklyn. That kind of thing is, I think, very, very cool and very easy to do with the Mini 2. If you want to add some more, there's also the Syrup Genie 1. So the Mini 2 just rotates. The Genie 1 also rotates, so you could get one or the other if all you want to do is rotate. But it also has 2 different bases. So it has a rotation base, and it has a movement base that has cords, it has cables that will allow you to attach it to any slider you may have. I have an old Manfrotto slider. There's a Syrup slider you can get. You can attach it to any slider, and it becomes a slider that will move. So you can set the speed and how much it moves, which is fantastic. You can attach it to other things. I keep meaning to try putting it on a skateboard and running it out as long as possible and seeing how that goes. I haven't tried it yet. But with this, you can attach it to things that aren't the normal slider things. Like my slider's 3 feet. That's great. But if I want to go 20 feet, I can't do that with my slider. With the Syrup Genie 1, you can add longer cables and make it go further. So it's very cool. And you can add something like the pan tilt bracket, which works with the Genie or the Genie Minis and allows you can see here grayed out, they've got a mini on the bottom and a mini on the side, which allows you to move in multiple axes. So instead of just rotating, you can rotate and go up, or you can slide to the right and rotate up. So I'm using a Mini 2 here and the Genie 1 on a slider. As it's going, the camera is moving to the right and slowly tilting up, which is a really, really cool feature to be able to do. This is to set up a different shot. So Manfrotto gimbal, you can see the black cables. It's got a little Velcro thing that you just put at the ends. The pan tilt bracket's on there, and then the Mini 2 is on the left to rotate the camera up and down. You get the cable that's appropriate for your camera. So with mine, it's the USB Mini. Plug it in, start it up the app, tell it what you want to do. It's really, really, really cool. If you're going to use more than one device in the app, you tell it. So when you go to connection, there's a Genie 1 and a Mini 2. You just tell it to connect. Make sure the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi is on your phone or on your like your tablet. I sometimes use my iPad. You can rename what they're called. So I named my Mini 2 Mini 2A. So if I get a second one, I can call it Mini 2B. And if I have 3 devices, I could slide, rotate, and tilt. So you connect everything. If you're doing multiple things, instead of time lapse, you would go to keyframe. And it's really simple. The sort of teal slider up and down, you just move that back and forth. The camera moves. The orangish one, the salmon colored one, left and right, you move it to wherever you want the camera to start. Once the camera is tilted the direction you want and moved on the slider the direction you want, you just hit start. And then using those, you have everything move to where you want it to end. Once it's in the place you want it to hit end, you hit end. It comes up with done, where I did do a screenshot of it, but where it says skip changes to done. And it shows you what it's going to do. At the top, much like before, you pick your record time, your interval, your play time. One important thing is at the bottom, it's going to default to video straight out of the box. So you go to that, you just click on the 3 little dots, go to video, switch it to time lapse. That's important because otherwise with video, still great, it just moves constantly. And with time lapse, typically you want it to move, take a picture, move, take a picture, move, take a picture, and not just move constantly, because then you're going to get that that horizontal blur. You want the blur that feels right. Like if there's the building and cars going by, the building should be static, should not be blurry, but the cars should be. So you want to make sure that you're on time lapse. Hit OK. And then on the right, you've got the record thing. You just tell it to go. This is 6 seconds in. Super cool. Very, very easy to use. At the very least, just the Mini 2 with the rotation is fantastic. This is just a slider with the Genie 1 on a slider. Another sunset shot in Brooklyn. Really nice. You can just having that movement really levels up the time-lapse game. There are people, there's another Sony artisan, Drew Geraci, who does amazing, amazing time lapses. It's most of what he does. I do it some. He does it all the time. He did the intro to House of Cards. He's worth looking up if you want to learn more. I find that with a lot of time lapses, just having that movement makes it feel more dynamic, hence the dynamic movement, and just more interesting. It doesn't feel static. It feels like something that just feels impressive. And then, so we've moved the camera with the Genie Mini, with the Genie 1. There's also hyperlapse. So hyperlapse, depending on who you talk to, is the camera moving during a time lapse. There's a couple ways to do it. So this is Flatbush in Brooklyn. This is a hyperlapse done on a tripod. That's the simplest way to do it if you don't have much. So if all you have is that Element 2 tripod, you can do a hyperlapse. But as you can see, it's fairly consistent where it's centered, but it moves a little left and right because the ground isn't even. So you can see the camera's just on the tripod. If you're going to do it that way, which is fine, and you can accept the fact that the ground just isn't even unless you're in an airport going right down the runway. Start there, but then think about how are you going to be consistent with where the camera is pointed. I like to use the cracks in the sidewalk if they are there as every horizontal crack. That's the next camera position because those are consistent. And then here I lined up the two legs on the tripod, the other two legs on the seam between the brick and the concrete. So every click, I moved forward one crack, two left legs on the seam, right leg on the crack, next. Still manual focus, still manual exposure, still manual white balance, selected white balance. But that's the easiest way, in my experience, to try and do a hyperlapse with a tripod. You can, instead, if you don't have any markings like that, if you center something in your frame, and then every time you move forward, you just make sure that that stays in the center of your frame. So maybe you're in Central Park heading towards one of the tunnels or bridges, just make sure that that thing is in the same position in the frame every time as you move forward. Take 2 big steps, set the camera down, aim, 2 big steps, set the camera down, point. That's another way to do it. It's a lot of work, but there's a lot of great things that come from doing a lot of work. If you're going to do it the way I did, you'll also want to experiment with what the interval is. So I tried 2 seconds first. It was not long enough for me to pick up the camera and reset. I tried 4 seconds. It was also not long enough for me to pick up the camera and reset. It was 2/3 of the time, and then the other third, I was missing it. So 6 seconds worked great for me. The disadvantage of that is that 6 seconds was a longer interval than I wanted visually. So it's a tricky thing. If you're going to do it where you're recomposing each time, you may not want to use an intervalometer. You may want to trigger it manually. So you walk forward, re-aim, level, take a picture, walk forward, re-aim, level, take a picture. You can do all that. At the very minimum, you need a tripod for that. Or like the video I showed at the beginning, this is with a gimbal. So this is with the Manfrotto 460 gimbal. Because it's on a gimbal, I can set the interval to just go, the intervalometer to just go, and I just walk. And it feels a lot smoother to me than the hyperlapse done on a tripod. It still bounces around a little, but it feels more natural and it feels more consistent. If that's the kind of thing that interests you, I really, really recommend a gimbal. So I use the Manfrotto 460. I really like it. It holds a lot of weight. When you're looking at a gimbal, make sure that whatever you're getting can hold your camera plus whatever the biggest lens you think you might put on it is. So Manfrotto also has the 220 gimbal, still a great gimbal. It's just a smaller payload. It's about, 4.85 pounds. If you're shooting APS-C, that might be enough. If you're going to do it with your phone, that's more than enough. Just depends on what you're using and how you want to capture. You'll have to balance it. It's not super complicated. It's just moving things around. And then depending on what camera you have, with the 460, I'm not sure about the 220, you can also use that to capture a time lapse to trigger your camera from the gimbal. It's a cool feature. It unfortunately isn't supported with my newer cameras. I'm not sure if it will be or not, but there's a list of all the cameras that support it, so you can take a look. A gimbal is awesome. If you're going to do video and time lapse both, especially, I think everybody who captures video should have a gimbal. The image stabilization in modern cameras is amazing. The image stabilization in my Sonys is amazing. Still not as smooth as a gimbal. So here it is on the gimbal. The balance is where the camera is set properly horizontally without it powered on. Not that hard to do. If you have a smaller camera, maybe you want to use a phone, GorillaPod's a great option. The 1K, the 3K, the 5K, the Manfrotto Pixie, one of my favorite things, always in my bag, can also work. It'll support a camera if you are, let's say, doing a time lapse somewhere where maybe a tripod might be allowed, it might not be allowed. Sometimes the Pixie is small enough that nobody cares. You know, make sure you're safe. If somebody tells you you can't do it, bear that in mind. The Manfrotto gimbal also has the nice remote. You've got your nice charger. One thing with time lapse is you will eat through batteries like nobody's business because the camera is firing every however many seconds and it's constantly on and constantly going. It's a little bit like capturing video straight through. It will go through batteries much faster than when you're shooting stills. So having something like this, like the Pro Cube, where you can charge multiple batteries at once, really helpful. GorillaPod 3K, keep that lens clean. There's also a few other things that you might consider getting depending on how nerdy you want to get, how technical you want to get. This is something I made for a bike fitter in Brooklyn. A time lapse of him doing a fitting. This is where, if you're really, really into cycling, I had it done when I did my Ironman back when I was much fitter. You know, they do all the stuff to figure out exactly what size your bike should be and exactly where the pedals should be and the seat and all this stuff. So capturing this, there's not always a place you can put a tripod. So at the very beginning, we talked about that editorial assignment where I had a camera up in the corner. You can't just set the camera in the corner. You may not be able to put it on a tripod. There may not be room. So there are other things that you can get. So the Manfrotto camera platform, it's this little device, mounts to it'll mount to a light stand. It'll mount to a magic arm. This is a magic arm. Your camera mounts to that. It mounts to something else. With this magic arm, you can bend it around and just lock it in with that lever. I can then take this super clamp, put the magic arm in the super clamp, put the camera platform on the magic arm, clamp it to a doorway or a window or a railing or a piece of furniture or a tripod that already has a camera on it or any number of things, and do a countertop and place the camera anywhere I want. So for that cooking thing I did at the beginning, I had the camera up in the corner on a shelf. The camera's backed into a corner, but it worked great. You can lock it in. Super cool. Really, really worth considering. And then also something to consider is a C-stand, which is a light stand that's more stable and heavier, that typically has a knuckle and an arm. So I have used this with the camera platform to get up 9 feet, 10 feet high, tilt the camera and put it in a corner somewhere and let it run. It takes up less space than like my Gitzo Giant tripod, which also goes this high, but is a much bigger footprint. Do you need this? Not necessarily. Is it useful if you're in the situation where it would be useful? Very much so. All right. So you've done all that. You've made your cool time lapse, or you've taken all your cool pictures. Now what? We're going to talk about assembling your time lapse. So there's a lot of ways to do it. You can do it in Premiere. You can do it in a lot of things. The simplest way, I think, to do it is with Photoshop, which sounds weird, I know. But Photoshop will build a time lapse for you. So if you're going to do that, the important thing is that your time lapse frames have to be numbered sequentially. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. And you need to only have those numbers in the folder you're going to use. So let's say you took a bunch of pictures with your camera. Frames 240 through 600 are the time lapse, but you have frames 100 through 239 and 601 through 700 also in the same folder. move the time-lapse files into a different folder because it's not going to know that you want it to end there. You go to File, Open. You navigate to your folder. You select, so in this case, with time-lapse files, I start with TL, the date, underscore TL underscore 21 underscore 0527 underscore A because it's the A setup, and then a number. Click on that first image only. And then you can see under there, there's in blue, image sequence. You check that box to the right of Open Cloud Sequence at the bottom of that window. First image, open image sequence, or image sequence, hit open. Now you're going to select your frame rate. So it defaults 10, 12, 12 and a half, which is weird, 15, 23,976, which is really what 24 is, 24, 25, etc. Or you can do a custom one. Pick your frame rate. And to give you a sense, this is 24 frames a second. Standard motion picture film, 24 frames a second. It's what we're used to. Feels pretty natural. This is 15 frames a second. So you can see it feels a little off. It feels a little jerky. Like things still feel like motion, but it's not quite the same. And then this is 60 frames a second. So everything's much faster. It's still smooth. Which is right for you? I don't know. It depends on what you're doing. I used to do all my time lapses at 15 frames a second because I wanted it to feel like a time lapse, and I felt like it needed to be a little jerky to do that. Is that the right answer? I don't know. At the time I thought so. Now I don't do it that way anymore. It's subjective. Whichever works for you is what works for you. So you pick your frame rate, and it's not the end of the world. You pick it, and if you decide you want to redo it again later, it doesn't matter. So that just opens up in Photoshop. It looks like it's just one picture. And then you just go to File, Export, Render Video. Tell it what size it is. Tell it where to go. Give it a name. That's it. It exports the video, and you're done. That made you a time lapse. Super easy, assuming you have Photoshop. Really, really easy way to do it. So now that we know how to do it, there's other things that come into play. How big do you want your time lapse to be? If you are capturing with your camera, say you have a 24 megapixel camera, like the A7 III, that is going to be roughly 8K-ish. If you've got something like the R4, which is 61 megapixels, I guess that would be, I assume 18K-ish, but I'm not sure on that. I'm not actually sure how big 18K would be. Think about what you want the final thing to be. Standard definition, little tiny, 640 by 480. Old HD, 1280 by 720. Standard HD, 1920 by 1080, which for a lot of things is enough, honestly. 4K, 3840 by 2160, or Cinema 4K is 4096 on the long side, and then the short side varies. With Cinema 4K, the consistency is there, and then as the aspect ratio changes, there's just fewer pixels top and bottom. 8K around 7680 by 4320. One thing to keep in mind if you're building a time lapse and doing all this, especially if you start getting into After Effects and doing really crazy stuff, which we're not really addressing. Drew Geraci does in some of his videos, and I really recommend taking a look at him. But we're keeping it simple. Think about making it bigger than you need, as big as you think you will ever need it, so that you don't ever have to do it again. You've got a final thing. But if you have to do it again, you do it again. There was a time when standard definition seemed great. All right, so you've done all that. You've thought about how big you want it to be. Then you think about the aspect ratio. We talked about that last time with the video. Most cameras are 3:2. HD and 4K TVs are typically 16:9. And some cinema is 21:9. Some is even wider. So think about that. when you're shooting video normally, 16:9. If you're capturing video with your camera, it's 16:9, unless you have a cinema camera and you can change it. So this is uncropped, just 3:2, straight out of camera. It's, you know, it's whitish, but it doesn't feel the way cinematic video feels, which is more horizontal. This is on a Mini 2 rotating. So it's fine, but it doesn't feel like cinema to me. This is 16:9. Same clip. It feels a little bit more like a modern TV show or movie because it's more horizontal. Cropped a little bit more, it just feels more that way, just because that's what we're conditioned to do. Or this is 21:9, which feels more cinematic. Is an overused term. Everybody talks about this lens is cinematic or how to capture whatever cinematic. And obviously that word means different things to different people. But to me, 21:9 is a more cinematic aspect ratio. Everybody's different. Everybody has different opinions. Totally fine. I like the 21:9. All right. So you've thought about how big. You've thought about your aspect ratio. You've built your time lapse. And then you have this. So I don't know if you can see that it's flickering. It feels like there's darker frames. It's weird. One of the reasons this is happening is because when you're doing a time lapse like this, where it's daytime to night, that's an example of where you can't necessarily have everything locked on manual because the exposure is changing too much for that to work. When I do that, I'm typically on aperture priority because I don't want the depth of field to change. I'm okay with the shutter changing more than the depth of field. But to do that, the camera reacts like clouds go in front of the sun. It reacts. It changes the exposure a little. It's always trying to get to be normal and accurate. And as a result, things change between, frame 212 is a little brighter than 211. And you see it. That's flicker. It's a drag. So there's a plugin for Premiere. It's also for other software called Flicker Free that I use. I have no affiliation with Digital Anarchy. So this is the same video after running Flicker Free. And now, if there's any flickers, I'm not noticing them. It really helps clean that up. It's the simplest way to do it. I'm sure that there are other ways, but I like the easy way. So same thing here. So that shot I showed you at the beginning, you can see the flickering because those clouds are coming in and out, blocking the sun. It's changing the exposure. The camera's reacting because that's what they're supposed to do. But when we look at it, it's distracting. It feels weird. It feels wrong. Same thing after running Flicker Free. So as you advance, it's something to think about. Also, you might want to think about, do you want to add sound? So I talked about some of these last week. There's a bunch of things out there. If you're going to use music or sound, make sure it's something you have the rights to. I use Artlist. It's an annual subscription. There's a bunch of things out there. There are things like the Free Music Archive that will let you use music for free with certain conditions. Moby has Moby Gratis, where you can use some Moby songs for free for non-commercial projects. I'm not sure how they define non-commercial, though. There's a lot of stuff out there. There's ways to get music for free that you're allowed to use. We all want people to not use our stuff without asking, so don't use other people's stuff without asking. So some of these also have, in addition to music, they have sound effects. So this is that clip from Atlantic from earlier. It's fine. Lots of cars moving. I like the S train going by. Here, I've added music. It makes it feel a little more interesting to me. Having the music is cool. I like it. And here, I've added music, and some sound. You've got car sounds going by. It feels a little more natural because there's cars. Doing those little things, adding a little bit of sound, adding a little bit of music can really make your time lapse a lot more interesting. I really like it. Do I do it on all of them? No, of course not. But it is a cool feature and it's something to play with. I do all that in Premiere. All right. If you're going to start messing around with them after building them, so you're going to want to use a video editor. Same video editors I showed last time. I use Premiere and Resolve. Different people use different things. If you're on a Mac, you should have iMovie, which is free. It's limited, but I would start with something that you have. Windows Movie Maker, DaVinci Resolve has a free version. Then some resources. Again, I really recommend taking a look at Drew Geraci's YouTube channel. Manfrotto Imagine More has a bunch of stuff. The Syrup YouTube channel has a ton of cool information, especially about how all their devices work and the cool things you can do with them that sometimes you're like, oh, that is cool. It didn't occur to me I could do that. All right. Let's see if we have any questions while I drink my water.
Excellent. Thank you, Tony. That was great. A lot of information to decode. One question that I think people might be wondering. One of the things that you mentioned was exporting at the highest resolution possible.
Yes.
So is there any sort of complications with that when you're now trying to maybe scale that down? Because clearly, in terms of 8K, we're starting to see some capabilities in the 8K realm. Not a whole lot, but they're starting to come out slowly, and we're seeing, from certain manufacturers are starting to enable that it's a capability. But just the playback isn't there yet for most consumers.
That's a fair point. So you have two options. You could build it in 8K, for example, and then go into a video editor and export a version that's smaller. But you're right. A lot of computers you could do it in 8K and then you try and play it and it's just going to stutter and not work very well. So that is a good point. Or if you're doing full resolution on like the R4, like probably nothing. I haven't tried that. I should, just to see what happens. But that's just going to be a mess to play. So that is worth bearing in mind. If you're going to just do it in Photoshop and be done with it, then you probably want to limit it to 4K or 10 or HD, so 1920 by 1080, only because there are those limitations. Like the HD should play on anything that's been built in the last 10 years. If you go to your parents' house and they still have that computer from 1995, not so much, but
maybe the old CRT TV sitting in the basement. Right.
We hook up the Blu-ray player to that one.
Yeah.
But anything relatively modern, HD should be fine. 4K on a 10-year-old computer, it's going to depend on the computer. So do bear that in mind. That's a good question.
Awesome. And kind of going into that, I think that also creates, a conversation of limitations also on computers, in terms of what your computer is capable of handling in terms of rendering and things like that. I'm sure, rendering a 4K file on a 10-year-old MacBook or even, PC is going to take, a lot longer than something that's got the newest M1 chip. So, definitely be aware of that for people who are shooting, higher resolutions.
Well, and the newer, fancier video cards. I mean, there are people who have video cards that cost $5,000 to do this stuff. I'm not one of those people.
Join the club. It's okay. We'll make our own little club of non $5,000 graphic cards. Well, Tony, thank you very much for joining us again. As always, a wealth of knowledge that you've shared with us. For those who maybe hopped on a little bit later and didn't catch it, this was the third part of a 3-part installment. So if you want to go back and rewatch the previous 2 parts, you can do that on livestream.com/VH Event Space. You can also watch this particular part on there as well. So they'll all be up there. You can search it up. I want to say thanks again, Tony, for joining us. Can't wait to see you again because I know you're always bringing your A game. You're always bringing tons of information. So I really appreciate it. And I also want to thank Vitech Imaging Solutions for, giving us Tony.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much again for everybody else who's joined us today. We really appreciate it. We can't wait to see you again. We'll catch you at the next one.